The flatbed pulled up on a Wednesday morning, which was already the wrong kind of day. Colt Harwood had been under a '94 Silverado since 6:30, chasing an exhaust leak that kept moving every time he thought he had it, and he heard the air brakes from the pit before he saw anything. He slid out from under the truck on the creeper, stood up, and wiped his hands on a rag that wasn't going to help. Through the open bay doors, he could see the flatbed idling at the edge of his gravel lot, and on the back of it, chained down in 2 rows, were 4 motorcycle engines and what looked like the block and heads of 2 V8s. All of them coated in the particular gray-brown of long neglect. He walked out. The driver was a kid in his early 20s with a clipboard, already pulling the pin on the rear chain. He didn't look up. "Harwood Auto? That's me. Got a delivery order." He handed Colt the clipboard. At the top, in clean corporate letterhead, Vantage Meridian Holdings. Below it, a single instruction line. Dispose of or auction at receiving party's discretion. No return, no invoice required. Colt looked at the engines on the flatbed, then back at the paper. "These aren't being repaired?" The driver shrugged. "My job's to drop them. Where you want them?" He pointed to the side lot. The kid unloaded all 6 with a small hydraulic lift and was back in his cab inside 12 minutes. Colt stood in the gravel looking at them. The morning was cold and still, the kind of October quiet that makes every sound carry. A dog somewhere, a screen door, the tick of cooling metal as the flatbed disappeared down Route 9. He crouched down in front of the first one. It was a 427 cubic inch V8, late 60s origin. The kind of engine that would have gone into a muscle car worth remembering. Under the grime, the casting numbers were still legible. He pressed his thumb against the block near the head gasket and felt what he was looking for. Solid, not cracked. Someone had let this thing sit until it looked dead, but dead and broken are not the same thing. And Colt Harwood had spent 17 years as a powertrain engineer before he ever picked up a wrench for himself. He knew the difference. He stood and looked at all 6. He went inside and called the number on the letterhead. A woman answered on the second ring. Her voice had that particular quality of someone who fields calls between more important things. He told her who he was, gave the delivery order number, and explained what had arrived. "Yes," she said. "Those were cleared from one of our acquisition properties. Is there an issue?" "No issue," Colt said. "I just want to make sure. These are mine now? No claim on them?" "Mr. Harwood, Vantage Meridian has no further interest in those assets. The disposal order is signed and dated. Is there anything else?" There wasn't. He hung up and stood at his workbench for a long moment. Through the window, he could see his daughter Nessa's school bus making its turn at the end of the street, still a couple hours out. He had time. He went back to the side lot with a notebook. Colt had moved to Dunore, West Virginia 14 months earlier, which is not the kind of move a man makes when things are going well. Before Dunore, he'd been in Detroit, working for a mid-sized performance engineering firm called Calvert Dynamics. Good salary, good title, good future in the abstract sense that never quite becomes real. Then his wife, Lynn, got sick in March and died in November, and by February he was done. Not broken, exactly, but the kind of done that doesn't have a next step attached to it. His wife's parents were in Dunore. They were older, good people, and they'd offered to help with Nessa while he figured things out. He'd sold the house in Ferndale, bought a small property on Route 9 with a 2-bay garage attached, and started taking in whatever work came through. Tires, brakes, the occasional transmission. It wasn't engineering. It paid the utilities and not much else. Nessa was 9. She did her homework on the workbench most afternoons because she said the smell of motor oil made it easier to concentrate, and Colt had decided that was either a psychological response to grief or a sign that she was going to be a mechanic, possibly both. He hadn't told anyone in town much about Detroit. People in Dunore were polite about not asking. He was the widower with the quiet kid who fixed cars. That was enough of a story for most. The 6 engines changed his calculation. The first thing he did was pull apart the 2 V8s. He worked through the weekend, Nessa cross-legged on a stool reading a library book and occasionally handing him tools when he asked. By Sunday evening he had both blocks cleaned, inspected, and documented. Crankshafts were sound. One head needed work, a warped surface, fixable with machine work. Pistons on both were original issue and in better shape than they had any right to be after what looked like 15 years of sitting. The 4 motorcycle engines were a different story. Two were late 1960s British inline fours from a manufacturer that had gone out of business before Colt was born. One was a racing variant that he had to look up twice before he believed it. The fourth was domestic, a pushrod twin from an era when American bikes were built like farm equipment, which was a criticism and a compliment in equal measure. He took photographs, made his list, priced out what he'd need. "What are those?" Nessa asked, looking at his notes. "Engines. I know they're engines. What are you going to do with them?" "Fix them." She thought about that. "All of them?" "That's the plan. That seems like a lot." "It is a lot," he agreed. She went back to her book. He ordered $2,200 in parts that night, which was more than he'd spent on the garage itself in any single month. And he did it without quite deciding to, which is usually how the real decisions get made. The trouble with Dunore, the specific structural trouble, was a man named Bradford Kaine. Colt didn't know this yet. He wouldn't know it for another 6 weeks. Bradford Kaine ran a company called Kaine Heritage Restorations out of a converted warehouse on the east end of town. On the surface, it was a legitimate operation: classic car restorations, estate sales, specialty brokerage. It had a nice website and a couple of write-ups in regional car magazines. But the way it actually made money was more complicated, and not in a legal way. The property the 6 engines had come from, the acquisition property that Vantage Meridian Holdings had cleared, was a private collection belonging to a man named Rufus Tull, who had died in August without close family. Vantage Meridian was a holding company that had purchased the Tull estate. What Vantage Meridian didn't know, because it hadn't been disclosed, was that 3 of those engines, both V8s and the British Racing Inline 4, had been documented in Rufus Tull's private catalog as part of a set with historical provenance certificates. The certificates made them worth considerably more than scrap. The certificates had gone missing from the estate records before Vantage Meridian took possession. Bradford Kaine had those certificates. He'd had them for 2 months, and he'd been waiting for the engines to disappear through the disposal chain before he used them, at which point he'd produce a parallel set of the engines, sourced elsewhere, fraudulently paired with the genuine documents, and sell the package to a private collector in Richmond who'd been asking for exactly that combination for 3 years. The plan worked only if the real engines were gone, dismantled for parts, sold for scrap, sitting in a landfill somewhere. Instead, they were in Colt Harwood's side lot in Dunore, West Virginia, and Colt Harwood was cleaning them up with a toothbrush. He met Lorine Tull at the hardware store on a Thursday in November, which he would think about later, as the kind of coincidence that isn't one if you live in a town of 3,000 people. She was looking at penetrating oil, and he was looking at penetrating oil, and they both reached for the same brand at approximately the same time. She pulled her hand back and said, "Go ahead." "There's 2, he said. "I'll take one. You take one." She smiled. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, with dark hair and the kind of unhurried manner that either comes from confidence or exhaustion, and he couldn't tell which. She had on a canvas jacket with a tear at the left shoulder that had been carefully sewn back up. "You're the one who opened the place on Route 9, she said. It wasn't a question. "Guilty." "My truck's been making a sound." "What kind of sound?" "She made a sound." He recognized it immediately. Tie rod end, probably driver's side, the kind of thing that gets ignored until it becomes critical. "Bring it in," he said. She did the following Monday. He fixed the tie rod and a loose heat shield while he was under there, charged her for the tie rod, and told her the heat shield was nothing. She asked what she owed for his time, and he said he didn't charge for incidentals. She looked at him in a specific way that he didn't examine too closely. Her name was Lorine Wicknow, had been Tull before she married, and she'd spent the last 2 months dealing with the aftermath of her uncle Rufus's estate. She mentioned this while writing him a check in the office, not as a significant piece of information, just context, the way people fill silence. He didn't register the name Tull. Why would he? By December, he had the first V8 running. He'd had to track down a machinist in Morgantown for the head work, and the correct carburetor had taken 3 weeks to source, and he'd rebuilt the intake twice before the fuel delivery felt right. But on a Tuesday evening with Nessa asleep upstairs, and the garage to himself, he turned the key on the test bench, and the engine lit up with a sound that was something close to an argument. It was loud and uneven at first, the way all old engines are when they first wake up, and then he made small adjustments and it smoothed out into something that had no polite modern equivalent. A low, declarative rumble that you felt in your back teeth. He sat on the stool for a long time just listening. He thought about Lynn, which he didn't always try to do. She had found his work baffling and had said so, cheerfully and often, but she'd always been the first person he called when something went right. There was nobody to call now. He thought about that too. He took some photographs of the running engine for his own records and went to bed. The second V8 came online 3 weeks later. Easier, because he knew the particular idiosyncrasies of the design by then. The British racing engine required parts from 2 different suppliers in England, one of which did not ship internationally, and Colt spent an afternoon on the phone until he found a workaround through a restorer in Montreal. Nessa sat nearby eating a sandwich and periodically commenting on his negotiating style in a tone that suggested she'd picked up more of her mother than either of them talked about. "You're very polite," she said after he'd thanked the Montreal man for the 4th time. "People do more for you when you're polite." Mom always said the same thing. He put the phone down and looked at her. She was right. Nessa nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd been working out. She finished her sandwich and asked if she could label the parts boxes, and he said yes, and she spent the next hour making labels with a level of systematic organization that made him feel quietly inadequate. Colt started finding inconsistencies in January. He'd been cross-referencing the engine serial numbers against collector databases, partly out of professional habit, partly because a running original V8 from this year and configuration was worth knowing more about. The serial on the first engine matched a production run that had been documented in a private collection catalog he found referenced in a collector forum. The collection belonged to a man named R. Tull, Dunore, WV, deceased. He stared at the screen for a while. Then he called Lorine. She came by the next morning. He showed her what he had, the production records, the serial number, the catalog reference. She looked at it and got very still in the way that people do when something clicks into place that they'd felt was wrong for months without knowing what it was. "Those were in Uncle Rufus's collection," she said. "Looks like it." But the estate attorney said the collection had been appraised and cleared. The engines weren't listed. "They should have been," Colt said. "These 2 V8s alone, with documentation, are worth between $40,000 and $60,000 each in the current market. The British racing engine is worth more." She sat down on the stool he kept near the workbench. She didn't say anything for a moment. "What documentation?" she said finally. "Provenance certificates, production records, racing history for the British engine in particular. It was campaigned in 1969 and 1971 at 2 different European events. If those certificates still exist, the package value goes considerably higher. Vantage Meridian told me the collection was worth $40,000 total. Auction estimate." Colt looked at her. Didn't say what he was thinking, which was that someone had given Vantage Meridian an appraisal that was criminal in its inaccuracy. He said instead, "Who did the estate appraisal?" She pulled up a name on her phone. He wrote it down and then looked it up while she sat there, and within 10 minutes he'd found that the appraiser had done 6 other estate jobs in the past 2 years in a 40-mile radius, 4 of which had involved sales or disposals to a single buyer. Bradford Kaine. Lorine wanted to call an attorney that afternoon. Colt asked her to wait 48 hours. He wasn't sure why, exactly, some older instinct from his engineering years, where you validated every assumption twice before you committed to a design path. He spent the next 2 days documenting everything he could about the engines, pulling every serial and casting number and cross-referencing them against what public records existed. He found a record of the racing inline 4 in a 1971 event program that had been scanned and uploaded by a British vintage racing club. The engine number matched exactly. He also, through a contact at Calvert Dynamics who still did specialist consulting, quietly inquired about Kaine heritage restorations. What came back was not surprising by then, but it was specific. 2 complaints with the Virginia State Corporation Commission. One settled insurance dispute involving misattributed provenance, and a name that kept appearing in specialist circles as someone you verified twice before you dealt with. Colt had the documentation together by Friday morning. Lorine brought her attorney, a woman named Dara Chance, from the county seat who specialized in estate disputes and had a manner that suggested She had heard most things and been surprised by very little. Colt laid out what he had. Dara Chance asked 3 questions, took the documentation, and said she'd be in touch with the Vantage Meridian legal team by end of day Monday. What happened next was faster than Colt expected, and slower in some ways. Vantage Meridian moved quickly once they understood the scope of what had happened. They had a fiduciary interest that had been compromised, and their legal team did not find that interesting to ignore. The appraiser was contacted first. He retained an attorney within the hour, which told its own story. Bradford Kaine's warehouse was the subject of a court order by the following Wednesday, at which point investigators found, among other things, Rufus Tull's original catalog with the provenance certificates still in the back pocket, which Kaine had apparently not gotten around to removing. Colt heard about the certificates from Dara Chance, who called him on a Wednesday evening while he was making dinner. "The provenance documents are intact," she said. He turned down the stove. "All of them?" "All 6 engines are documented. The British racing engine has the full chain of custody going back to the original team that raced it." He leaned against the counter and didn't say anything for a moment. "Mr. Harwood," she said, "with documentation, the current market value of those 6 engines together is somewhere between $2.5 and $3 million. Nessa walked into the kitchen and looked at his face and said, "What happened?" "Something good," he said. "Go set the table." She gave him a long look that was very much her mother's and went to get the plates. The legal process took 4 months, which is fast by the standards of legal processes. Bradford Kaine was ultimately charged with fraud and evidence tampering, and the case against him was, in Dara Chance's careful phrasing, substantial. He did not contest most of it, which suggested his attorney had advised him plainly on his prospects. Vantage Meridian, once they understood that the disposal order had been issued in ignorance of the engine's actual value that had been deliberately obscured, made a good-faith settlement with the Tull estate. Lorine, as the surviving family representative, received a negotiated portion of the fair market value. The engines themselves, having been legally transferred by the original disposal order, were Colt's. Their established value was his. He did not sell them immediately. He thought about it differently than the numbers invited him to. What he decided eventually was this. The 2 V8s would go to the Richmond collector who'd originally been Kaine's target through a proper and legal sale arranged by a reputable broker. The domestic twin would go to a museum in Ohio that had been looking for exactly that engine for 8 years. The British Racing Inline 4 he kept, not because of what it was worth, but because of what it had been. Raced at speed by someone who'd believed in it enough to run it hard and then care for it enough to document every mile. He put it in the corner of the second bay, where he could see it from the workbench. Nessa asked him once why that one didn't get sold. He had to think about how to explain it to a 9-year-old. "Some things," he said finally, "you take care of not because of what you get back, because of what they are." She thought about that. "Like people." "Like people," he agreed. She nodded as if he'd confirmed something she already knew, which she probably had. Spring came to Dunore slowly, the way it does in the mountains. Not a single turn, but a series of adjustments. Warm days interrupted by cold snaps. The trees making decisions and then reconsidering. By April, the garage had more work than Colt could comfortably take on alone, and he hired a part-time help named Breck Huddy, a 26-year-old from the next county who was talented with his hands and had apparently decided that talent was enough to compensate for punctuality, which it mostly was. Lorine still came by, sometimes with her truck, which developed small problems with a regularity that he eventually understood was not coincidental, sometimes without it. She'd bring coffee in a thermos and sit in the office or just at the bay door when the weather allowed, and they'd talk about things that had nothing to do with engines or estates. She asked him about Detroit once, and he told her. Not everything, but more than he'd told anyone in Dunmore. She listened the way people listen when they're not waiting for their turn to speak. He didn't push it, and neither did she. But there was something growing there at the pace that real things grow. Not fast, not dramatic, just present and increasingly difficult to look away from. Nessa liked her. She said this once, plainly, while doing homework at the workbench. "I know," Colt said. "That's usually important." "It is. Okay," she said and went back to her math. He smiled at the workbench and pretended he hadn't. What he would think, later, about the Wednesday morning the flatbed pulled up. What he would come back to, not often but sometimes, sitting in the garage after Nessa was asleep and the work was done, was that nothing about it had felt like an opportunity. It had felt like an inconvenience. 6 dead engines that someone with more money than attention had decided weren't worth the cost of understanding. He'd been wrong about a lot of things in his life, about how much he could outwork grief, about how long a plan stays good once the ground shifts under it, about small towns and whether a man could disappear into one. But he hadn't been wrong about the engines. You look at something most people have written off, and you see past the grime and the years and the neglect to the thing itself, the construction, the intent, the care that someone put in once, long ago. That's not optimism. That's just knowing what you're looking at. He'd learned that from 17 years of engineering. He'd confirmed it in a gravel lot in Dunore, West Virginia, on a Wednesday morning in October, crouching down with his hand on a cold steel block while the flatbed driver walked back to his cab and the town went quiet around him. The engines had been waiting. They just needed someone who still knew how to listen.